Hi, so I just finished two digital paintings recently and I'm going to show a time-lapse video of my art process. I don't intend to narrate the technical aspects of my workflow since you can obviously just watch. Instead, I will be breaking down my thought processes and inspirations for these pieces and why I made my creative decisions. So yeah, let's get to it. This first piece was kind of a warm-up illustration. I haven't done fully rendered paintings in a while, so I had to get familiar with the process again, activate the muscle memory, so to speak. It's a character illustration and not a lot of thought put into it. This illustration, like most of my work, is often an excuse to paint male figures with the focus on the anatomy of the upper torso, but that can get very redundant and repetitive sometimes, and that's when I start to incorporate elements of fantasy in the pieces. This one in particular is a centaur, but that's kinda generic. What if he's part unicorn and part fairy? That's the general idea, but there's still an opportunity to make the illustration more interesting. Since he has big butterfly wings, what if he's gracefully landing down onto the earth? That presents a lot of possibilities for the pose. His action could go so many ways, but since I already established that he's gracefully landing down, that also puts a limit on what the gesture should look like. The gesture lines on the sketch are more curved and more relaxed. I want the pose to be delicate and gentle. Even the arms of the human torso are dramatically curved, even though it's a firm and strong limb in actuality. Now that I've solidified that the focal point of the illustration is the gesture, I have to find ways to emphasize that. A great portion of his centaur body is his horse half, so I made sure that the gesture lines on his stomach are curving downwards because I would assume it's heavy in weight. Do I really think a pair of butterfly wings would be enough to carry the weight of a full-sized horse and human? We don't really know, but that's the beauty of suspension of disbelief, right? The only straight and rigid elements on the illustration are his horse legs. I could have chosen to make those curvy and lanky as well, but I decided it needed to be firm and sturdy so you can imagine that he can actually sustain his weight, that he's actually mobile. For this one, even though his body is visually masculine, he has defined muscles, a fit and compact body type, I made sure he is posed rather feminine. I think it fits the design narrative perfectly. I initially wanted to give him a fro hairstyle, but I figured I wanted more of a flowy, wavy hair for this illustration. The overall shape of the hair also completes the illustration for me. I think it balances out the heavy bottom portion of the character. The sketching phase is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the basic shading of the figure and molding of the shape and form, nothing too elaborate, and then I proceed to lay down the base colors under it. The human character has dark skin, so I wanted the overall design to be monochromatic. I didn't realize this before someone pointed it out to me, but I really like to work with a very limited color palette. I think it makes way for the focus to be on the overall language and composition of the subject. So in this piece, I mostly worked with dark colors, blues, and whites. Even though the character is monochromatic, I have to make sure there is still distinction between some of these elements. His skin is dark, but it has warm undertones and shadows, while his horse half is jet black with almost blue undertones. His hair is the same color, but I painted pale blue streaks between his face and body and his hair. One of the things I learned in drawing class is learning how to work with negative space to distinguish the depth of each element. You can see this technique applied on his legs and on his tail, where these elements could visually clash with each other and create tangents and weird shapes. You can also do this to help your viewer identify what they're actually looking at. The silhouettes should be clear, and these are subtle distinctions you can make. I move on to the wings, which is intentionally simplistic in design. Like I said, the focal point of the painting is the gesture of the centaur gracefully gliding, so even though he has wings, I didn't paint it to have elaborate design. I kept it relatively flat because I didn't want it to take away from the pose of the figure. Its size is enough to serve a purpose. It's occupying visual space, but not enough to distract from the important figure. And lastly, for the background, I like to keep it simple but still interesting. I could go for a fill of flat color as the backdrop, but that would be too distracting against the subject. The character has defined pencil and brush strokes. He has a lot of textures and forms, so I need to match that even if it's subtle. I take a textured brush and just draw cross-hatching, shading. I often start by tracing the silhouette of the character and working outward into the bigger spaces. This helps me refine the figure and erase things that are unnecessary visually. And there you have it. Here's the finished piece. This next piece is more thought out, I would say, and I'll let you know that most of the time I don't plan my personal artworks. I rarely do thumbnails, explorations, mood boards. I often just think of an idea and just paint whatever, and this is an example of that. This painting is actually inspired by the previous artwork. I didn't get to paint gorgeous wings on him because of the intentional creative choice. Instead, I just made another artwork where the wings played the lead role because I was just fiending to paint beautiful butterfly wings. This artwork is also inspired by morpho butterflies. I thought since I was already using a lot of color blue in my art this year, this would be perfect for the concept. I didn't do much research on them, but I did have to look up what blue butterflies were actually called. So these butterfly wings are free-handed, and they're probably not anatomically accurate to any species. They're so visually striking, but their color is almost unnatural. Their wings don't really have blue pigments. It's more so the structure that makes them reflect light as blue. You can still argue that their wings are blue though, and you'd still be right. I thought that aspect made them alien and ethereal at the same time, so that's what the general motif of the illustration should be. Something unnatural but still sublime to look at. I thought I could draw an angel but with blue wings and blue skin instead. I just have to remember that the centerpiece of the artwork should be the wings. So I decided it should cover a great part of the canvas but not exceed it. The wings are more downturned and it almost made an arch shape. I thought that was a perfect framing device for the character who is rather static. The pose of the character makes him look like a very imposing figure, but I didn't want him to look like he's just standing there. Maybe he could extend his arm out as if he's holding something, and the idea came easily to me. What if he's holding a lamp? And maybe that lamp is attracting more butterflies. I thought the pose worked because his extended arm offsets the weight of the wings on the character since it's drooping downward on his right side. I thought it made the composition balanced and solid. It's just the designing part that needs a lot of work. So like I said, I freehanded the wing design. It's predominantly blue with dark line art and specks of white in some parts. For the character though, I just made some standard shading and rendering. He's a very basic character design. No shirt, toned muscles, big whoop, whatever. I instead chose to allocate my effort of detailing on his long toga. Or skirt. I'm not really sure what it is, but it is a ton of fabric draped around his waist. Interestingly enough, I chose to make this cloth white, same as his hair. I thought that was the best way I could keep the monochromatic aesthetic and just keep the overall illustration uniform. And I like the contrast of the bright fabric and his dark blue skin. I don't paint the best articles of clothing. I think figuring out how clothes fold and crease is difficult and puzzling, but I think I managed just fine. I'm not sure what type of fabrics these are and what structure they're forming around the character. I just know it needed to be long, detailed, and have a lot of layers. Speaking of the hair, I kept it rather simple when it came to rendering, but I think the white color adds to the otherworldly element of the character. I had several ideas for the lamp that wasn't solidified. Obviously, a lamp should be lit by fire, but I thought that would look out of place in the aesthetic of the painting so far, even if it's just a small candle. His halo is a peculiar thing because in the final artwork, you can barely see it, but I still made sure to paint an elaborate ornate pattern on it. I'm not sure why this is a thing I often do because unless you really look closely and study the artwork, you wouldn't notice that there are forms on the halo. Maybe I love how laborious it is and it doesn't matter to me how it looks in the end. The backdrop is rendered similarly to the previous painting. It's a lot of messy brushstrokes and hatching, but I made sure it matched the color of his hair and toga. I filled in the negative space to ensure the rough ends are erased and the character doesn't have a weird and unpolished silhouette. Again, the backdrop made the halo and circle around the lamp almost blend together, but I like the look. I imagined it functioned similarly to a sculpture, and these circles are carved or embossed on the background. I like the texture and design implication it had, so it wasn't an outright waste of time and effort. It looked cliche, but I opted for a magical light in the shape of a butterfly. It's the brightest element in the illustration, and I like its contrast with the lamp. I could have called it from this point, but I feel like there was still so much visual vacancy on the lower right part of the canvas. There needs to be something there, so I just scribbled a frame to emphasize the circle around the lamp. It's an ornate motif that I've always been obsessed with, and it's a great illustrating technique to fill in the parts of the backdrop that needed it. The final touches were the butterflies that blended in the backdrop. I wanted to create them in assorted shapes and sizes to make that part of the canvas more interesting than it actually is. But I also didn't want to overcrowd it. It hammers in the idea that this lamp is a beacon of light that attracts its followers, and it is heralded by a figurehead. Hence his opulent toga, majestic wings, and mysterious halo. And this is how I got the title for this artwork. I hope the video was informative and I hope my ramblings were interesting at the very least. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and I'll see you again next time.